The CEO lifted a glass of red wine in a crowded Manhattan restaurant when suddenly a waitress rushed forward and smashed the glass from his hand, wine exploding across the table as the entire room froze in shock. 30 minutes earlier, Emily Carter had overheard two men at the bar speaking Russian, one whispering quietly, "He drinks in 10 minutes." Her pulse spiked when she heard the next line. "After that, it will look like a heart attack." She watched them switch the wine bottle, glancing at the CEO's table again and again. Now the glass lay shattered on the floor. The CEO stared at her, furious, until security stopped the two men at the door and found the poison. Sometimes the smallest moment decides who walks away alive. The crystal lights of Whitmore House restaurant shimmered softly across white tablecloths and polished silver as Manhattan's elite spoke in quiet voices about billion-dollar deals and market forecasts. At the center table sat Daniel Whitmore, the 41-year-old CEO whose name was printed on half the tech headlines in America. His charcoal suit was perfectly tailored, his Swiss watch catching the light as he lifted a glass of red wine and listened to his investors discuss a new acquisition worth nearly $200 million. Around him the restaurant moved with quiet elegance. Plates glided across tables. Glasses clinked gently. Conversations floated like soft music in the air. And among the waitstaff moving between tables with practiced calm was Emily Carter, 27. Honey blonde hair, tied neatly back. A black apron and white shirt that made her nearly invisible among Manhattan's wealthy clientele. Most customers never looked twice at her. That was fine with Emily. Being unnoticed had its advantages. Because 30 minutes earlier, while delivering sparkling water to the bar, Emily had heard something that did not belong in a quiet Manhattan restaurant. Russian. Two men sat near the end of the bar speaking in low voices, their accents thick and deliberate. To everyone else it sounded like background noise. Foreign words lost beneath the hum of conversation and jazz piano. But Emily understood every word. Her hand had paused mid-pour when she heard the first sentence. "He drinks in 10 minutes. The second man had laughed softly, swirling the stem of his wine glass, as if discussing nothing more serious than the weather. After that, everything looks natural. Emily had felt a chill move down her spine, though the restaurant was warm and comfortable. She didn't turn around. She didn't stare. Years of discipline had taught her that the smartest reaction was sometimes no reaction at all. She simply set down the water pitcher, nodded politely, and walked away. But her mind was suddenly very awake. Because the two men weren't looking at the bar. They were looking across the dining room. At Daniel Whitmore. Since then Emily had watched quietly while continuing her shift. Watched the men speak again. Watch one of them check his watch. Watch the other stand up briefly and approach the wine display cabinet near the sommelier station. A small movement. Almost unnoticeable. But Emily noticed everything. She noticed when the wine bottle on Whitmore's table was replaced with another from the cabinet. She noticed the subtle nod exchanged between the two men afterward. She noticed the way they kept glancing toward Whitmore's table as the conversation with his investors continued. And now, 30 minutes later, the moment had arrived. Daniel Whitmore lifted the glass toward his lips, smiling slightly as one of the investors finished explaining a projection chart. Around the room nobody sensed anything unusual. The jazz piano continued playing. The chandelier lights shimmered across crystal glasses. Waiters moved between tables carrying trays of steak and seafood. Everything looked perfectly normal. Except Emily knew what those two Russian sentences meant. And she knew exactly how many seconds were left before the CEO took that first sip. Emily Carter moved before the room understood what was happening. One step forward, then another. Her heartbeat was steady even though every instinct in her body warned her that she might be wrong. The glass was already inches from Daniel Whitmore's lips when Emily reached the table. Her hand struck the base of the stem with a sharp motion. The crystal glass slipped from the CEO's fingers and shattered against the marble floor, red wine splashing across the white tablecloth and the polished shoes of several stunned investors. The sound echoed through the dining room like a sudden crack of thunder. Conversation stopped instantly. Forks paused halfway to mouths. The piano player missed a note and stared toward the table. Daniel Whitmore froze, shock crossing his face as he looked down at the broken glass and then slowly up at the waitress standing beside him. His first reaction was irritation. The kind of controlled irritation powerful men often carried, when something disrupted their carefully ordered world. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm but edged with disbelief. Emily did not answer immediately. Her eyes moved past him. Across the room, the two men at the bar had already stood up. One of them reached for his coat. The other was moving toward the exit with surprising speed. That was all the confirmation she needed. Emily leaned slightly toward the security guard station near Whitmore's table. Her voice remained quiet, steady, almost calm. "The two men leaving by the door," she said. They were speaking Russian. They switched the wine bottle. The guard frowned, unsure for half a second whether this was a misunderstanding. But Emily's expression did not look like a mistake. It looked certain. That was enough. Within seconds, the guard signaled another member of security near the entrance. The two men were stopped politely but firmly before reaching the door. The entire dining room watched in confusion as security spoke with them. Daniel Whitmore stood slowly from his chair. The irritation on his face had faded into something else now. Curiosity. Calculation. "What exactly is happening?" he asked quietly. Emily finally looked directly at him. For a moment the room seemed unusually quiet. "Sir," she said carefully, "I believe that wine should not be consumed." One of the investors at the table laughed nervously, assuming the comment was some strange misunderstanding. But Whitmore did not laugh. His eyes had shifted to the bottle sitting beside the broken glass. He noticed something most people would not have noticed. The label was slightly different from the one that had been opened earlier. Across the dining room, security returned with the two men. They were no longer trying to leave. Their expressions were tight, controlled, but something in their posture had changed. The restaurant manager rushed over, clearly alarmed by the sudden attention. "Mr. Whitmore, I apologize for the disruption," he said quickly. But Whitmore raised a hand slightly. His attention remained fixed on Emily Carter, a waitress who had just interrupted a dinner meeting worth millions of dollars, and possibly saved something far more valuable. Outside, the faint sound of approaching sirens began to echo along the Manhattan street. The sirens grew louder outside, echoing between the tall Manhattan buildings as red and blue lights reflected faintly across the restaurant's glass entrance. Inside Whitmore House, the elegant calm of the evening had completely vanished. Investors whispered to each other. Several guests turned in their chairs to watch the scene unfolding near the front door, where security held the two men in quiet conversation. No one raised their voice, but the tension in the room was unmistakable. Daniel Whitmore remained standing beside the table, one hand resting lightly against the back of his chair as he studied the wine bottle that sat beside the shattered glass. His mind worked quickly. Years of negotiating billion-dollar deals had trained him to notice details most people ignored. The bottle label was correct at first glance. The vintage was the same, but something about the seal looked slightly different. A detail so small that nearly anyone else would have missed it. His gaze slowly returned to Emily Carter. She stood a few feet away now, calm, hands folded lightly in front of her apron, as if she had simply completed another ordinary task in her shift. The restaurant manager rushed forward again, his face pale with concern. "Mr. Whitmore, the police are arriving. We will resolve this immediately. I assure you this situation is highly unusual." Whitmore barely seemed to hear him. His attention remained on Emily. "You said they switched the bottle," he said quietly. Emily nodded once. "Yes, sir." "How are you so certain?" Around them, the investors leaned closer, curiosity replacing their earlier confusion. Emily answered without hesitation. "Because I heard them discussing it." Whitmore's eyebrow lifted slightly. "Discussing it?" Emily glanced briefly toward the front door where the two men stood with security. Then she looked back at him. They were speaking Russian. A murmur moved through the nearby tables. Several guests exchanged surprised looks. One investor frowned. "You speak Russian?" Emily did not smile. "Yes." Whitmore studied her expression carefully. He had spent decades reading people across negotiation tables. Confidence, fear, deception. The woman standing in front of him showed none of those things. Only quiet certainty. The entrance doors opened and two police officers stepped inside, followed by another plainclothes investigator who immediately approached the security team. Within moments, the officers were examining the wine bottle and speaking calmly with the two detained men. The restaurant remained silent except for the soft hum of conversation and the faint music that still drifted from the piano in the corner. One of the officers carried the bottle carefully toward the investigator. A brief exchange followed. Then the investigator looked across the room directly at Daniel Whitmore. His expression had changed. Not alarmed, but serious. Whitmore understood that look immediately. Something was wrong. The investigator approached the table slowly, holding the bottle in a protective evidence bag that had appeared from a small kit. "Mr. Whitmore," he said calmly, "it was fortunate that you did not drink from this bottle tonight." A quiet chill seemed to move through the entire dining room. Whitmore's eyes shifted once more toward Emily Carter, the waitress who had heard a few quiet words in a language most people would never recognize, and decided to act before anyone else even realized there was a danger. The investigator placed the sealed evidence bag carefully on the table, the faint reflection of the restaurant lights glimmering across the plastic as the entire room watched in complete silence. Daniel Whitmore did not sit down. His posture remained still, composed, but the air around him had shifted. He had spent years in high-pressure negotiations, boardrooms, and international deals, yet this moment felt strangely different. This was no longer about business strategy or corporate competition. This was something far more personal. The investigator spoke calmly, his tone measured so that only those closest to the table could hear clearly. "Our preliminary field test suggests that the contents of that bottle were altered. We will confirm everything shortly, but I believe the waitress made the correct decision." A quiet ripple of disbelief moved through the nearby tables. Some guests leaned closer. Others exchanged uneasy looks. The elegant dinner atmosphere that had filled Whitmore House less than an hour earlier had now transformed into something far more tense and watchful. Daniel Whitmore slowly turned toward Emily Carter again. She had not moved much from where she stood. Her posture remained relaxed, almost quiet, as if she were simply waiting for the next table to serve. But her eyes were alert, observing everything. Whitmore studied her carefully. "You understood everything they said?" he asked. Emily nodded once. "Yes, sir. Every word. Every word." Whitmore exhaled slowly, the kind of controlled breath a man takes when realizing how close a moment may have come to changing everything. Around them, the officers continued their work. One officer quietly escorted the two detained men outside for questioning, while another carefully examined the wine bottle and the broken glass pieces that still rested on the marble floor. The restaurant manager instructed the staff to keep the remaining guests comfortable, though it was clear that most of them were far more interested in the unfolding situation than in their dinners. Whitmore glanced briefly toward the entrance where flashing police lights painted faint blue patterns across the windows. Then he returned his attention to Emily. "Why did you act so quickly?" he asked. "You could have been mistaken." Emily answered with the same calm tone she had used all evening. "I could have been." She paused for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "But the conversation I heard was very specific." Whitmore leaned slightly forward. "What exactly did they say?" Emily's eyes shifted briefly toward the bar area where the two men had been sitting earlier. "One of them said that you would drink in 10 minutes, she explained quietly. The other replied that afterward everything would appear natural. The investors at the table exchanged uneasy glances. Even without understanding the full context, the meaning was clear enough. Whitmore felt a subtle chill run through him. He had faced corporate sabotage before, legal attacks, market manipulation. But this was different. This was deliberate, personal. He looked again at the waitress standing calmly in front of him. Someone who had overheard 2 sentences in a language most people in the room would not recognize. Someone who had taken the risk of interrupting one of the most powerful men in the city in the middle of a critical dinner meeting. Someone who had likely prevented a disaster that would have shocked every business headline in the country the next morning. Whitmore finally spoke again, his voice quieter now. "Miss Carter," he said, "how exactly does a waitress in Manhattan speak Russian well enough to understand a conversation like that?" Emily Carter did not answer immediately. For a brief moment, she simply looked at Daniel Whitmore, measuring the question the way someone measures how much truth the moment requires. Around them, the restaurant remained unusually quiet. The investors at Whitmore's table were no longer thinking about market forecasts or acquisition deals. Every eye had shifted toward the young waitress who had just prevented something none of them fully understood yet. Emily finally spoke, her voice calm and steady. "I studied linguistics in college." Whitmore raised an eyebrow slightly. "Russian linguistics?" "Among others," she replied. The answer was simple, but it clearly raised more questions than it resolved. One of the investors leaned back in his chair with visible curiosity. You studied languages and you are working here? He asked. Emily gave a small, polite shrug. Life does not always follow the plan we write for it. The comment was quiet, but it carried a certain weight. Whitmore noticed that immediately. He had met thousands of people in his career, and he recognized the tone of someone who had learned to adapt rather than complain. Outside the window, the police lights continued to flash across the street. The investigator had stepped aside to speak with another officer while a second evidence bag was prepared for the wine bottle. The situation was now clearly serious enough to draw more attention. Yet Whitmore remained focused on the conversation in front of him. Where did you study? He asked. Emily hesitated only briefly. Georgetown University. That answer created another ripple of surprise around the table. Georgetown was not a casual school. Whitmore leaned slightly forward. That is a respected program. Emily nodded. Yes, sir. And you specialized in Russian? Russian and Eastern European languages. Whitmore studied her again, now more carefully than before. The quiet confidence in her posture. The precision in the way she spoke. The calm she had shown when interrupting his dinner just minutes earlier. None of it matched the simple label of waitress that most people in the room had already assigned to her. So you understood exactly what those men were planning, Whitmore said. Yes. And you decided to act. Emily answered with the same straightforward honesty she had used from the beginning. I believed it was necessary. One of the investors let out a slow breath. Not have been present in a wine of this type. We will conduct a full laboratory analysis, but the initial result supports what your waitress suspected. The word waitress seemed almost strange in the sentence now. Whitmore glanced at Emily again. The woman who had overheard a conversation in Russian. The woman who had interrupted a moment that might have changed everything. The woman who had risked her job in a room filled with powerful strangers simply because she believed someone needed to act. Whitmore folded his hands lightly on the table and spoke in a quieter voice now. Miss Carter, he said slowly, I believe we should talk after this situation is resolved. Because something tells me you are not simply a waitress who happens to speak Russian. Emily Carter held Daniel Whitmore's gaze for a quiet moment after his words settled over the table. Around them, the investigation continued in calm, controlled motions. Officers spoke quietly near the entrance while another carefully carried the evidence bag containing the altered bottle toward a waiting case. The elegant restaurant had not returned to normal yet, but the initial tension had shifted into something more thoughtful. Guests whispered among themselves, trying to understand what had almost happened in the middle of their dinner. Emily finally nodded once. If you would like to talk later, Mr. Whitmore, I will be here until the end of my shift. Whitmore gave a faint, thoughtful smile. That will work. He did not press further. Something about her tone suggested that she preferred not to explain everything in front of an audience. And Whitmore respected that instinct. Across the room, the investigator finished his conversation with the officers and approached again, this time holding a small notepad. Miss Carter, he said politely, we would appreciate a short statement about what you heard. Emily nodded calmly. Of course. She followed him a few steps away from the main table where the conversation would not disturb the remaining guests. Whitmore watched quietly from his seat as she spoke with the investigator. Her posture remained composed, her voice steady. She repeated the phrases she had heard in Russian and described the moment she saw the bottle switched near the wine cabinet. The investigator wrote carefully, occasionally asking a clarifying question. Whitmore noticed how precise her answers were. No exaggeration, no drama, just careful detail. That caught his attention more than anything else. Many people in a situation like this would try to dramatize their role. Emily Carter did the opposite. She simply described what she observed. 10 minutes later, the investigator thanked her and closed his notebook. The two men who had been detained earlier were now gone, escorted outside for further questioning. The flashing lights outside the windows had begun to fade as the situation moved beyond the restaurant itself. Gradually, the room started to breathe again. Conversations resumed in low voices. Plates were quietly replaced. Staff moved carefully through the dining room, restoring the calm atmosphere that Whitmore House was known for. Emily returned toward Whitmore's table once the investigator stepped away. Whitmore was now seated again, though the broken glass had been cleared and a fresh setting placed in front of him. He did not reach for the replacement wine that had been offered. Instead, he looked up at her with clear interest. Miss Carter, he said, I have a question. Yes, sir. When you heard that conversation at the bar, you had no guarantee it was about me. Emily nodded. That is true. You also had no guarantee you were interpreting it correctly. That is also true. Whitmore leaned back slightly in his chair. Yet you still interrupted the moment. Emily's answer came quietly. Because if I was correct, waiting would have been the wrong decision. Whitmore studied her for a long second. There was no hesitation in the response. No attempt to sound impressive. Only a simple explanation built on responsibility. One of the investors at the table shook his head slowly. Most people would have ignored it, he said. Emily offered a small, almost thoughtful smile. Most people did not understand the language. Whitmore felt himself smile slightly at that. It was the first moment of genuine ease since the entire evening had begun to unravel. He glanced once more toward the restaurant entrance where the police activity had now fully moved outside. Then he looked back at Emily Carter, the waitress who spoke Russian, the waitress who had listened when no one else could, and the waitress who had decided that a quiet warning was more important than her job for the evening. The restaurant slowly began to return to its quiet rhythm, but Daniel Whitmore knew the evening would never truly feel ordinary again. The soft music from the piano had resumed, waiters moved between tables with renewed care, and the remaining guests tried to settle back into their dinners. Yet every few minutes someone would glance toward the table where the CEO of Whitmore Technologies sat speaking with the waitress who had interrupted the entire room less than half an hour earlier. Daniel Whitmore rested his hands lightly on the table, studying Emily Carter with the same focused attention he normally reserved for business negotiations worth billions of dollars. It was not suspicion that filled his expression now. It was curiosity. Emily stood calmly beside the table, her posture relaxed but attentive, as if she were ready to return to work the moment the conversation ended. That detail caught Whitmore's attention again. Real time, and none of us noticed. Emily answered calmly. Most people do not expect that skill set from someone carrying a tray. Whitmore could not help smiling at that. It was a sharp observation, and it was true. For most of the evening, he had barely looked at the staff moving around the restaurant. Now one of them had completely altered the course of the night. Whitmore reached for the water glass that had replaced the wine and took a slow sip. Then he looked back at Emily Carter with a more serious expression. Miss Carter, he said quietly, when this situation first began, you risked losing your job to stop it. Emily nodded once. That possibility crossed my mind. Yet you acted anyway. Yes. Whitmore rested the glass back on the table. His voice became calm but deliberate. That is a rare quality. The investors at the table fell silent as they sensed the direction of the conversation changing. Whitmore continued speaking, his eyes never leaving Emily Carter. Because people who can listen carefully, think quickly, and act responsibly under pressure are extremely valuable. Emily did not respond immediately. She simply waited as the CEO of one of the most powerful companies in the city finished his thought. Whitmore's expression softened slightly. And I suspect, he said slowly, that tonight may not be the last time we have a conversation like this. Daniel Whitmore's words lingered in the air for a moment after he finished speaking, and the investors at the table exchanged quiet glances as if they were witnessing a conversation that was no longer about dinner or business. Emily Carter remained standing beside the table, her expression calm but thoughtful. She had spent months moving through this restaurant unnoticed, balancing trays and memorizing orders while the powerful people of Manhattan discussed mergers, markets, and investments around her. Now one unexpected moment had placed her directly in the center of that world. Emily finally spoke in a measured tone. I appreciate the compliment, Mr. Whitmore. Whitmore watched her carefully. That was not just a compliment. Emily understood what he meant immediately. The CEO of a global technology company did not speak casually about rare qualities unless he was already thinking several steps ahead. Around them, the restaurant had mostly returned to its normal rhythm. The investors who had been part of Whitmore's meeting were still seated, though. The tone of their conversation had shifted. Instead of financial forecasts, they now discussed what had nearly happened in the middle of the dining room. One of them leaned forward slightly. Daniel, he said quietly, I think tonight proves something interesting. Whitmore glanced toward him. What is that? The investor smiled faintly. Sometimes the most important intelligence in a room does not come from the people at the table. Whitmore gave a small nod. I was thinking the same thing. Emily did not react to the comment. though she clearly understood the implication. She had no interest in becoming the center of attention for the entire restaurant. Her instincts told her to keep the moment simple. "If there is nothing else you need this evening, Mr. Whitmore," she said politely, "I should return to my other tables." Whitmore looked at her for a second longer before answering. "Of course." Emily turned slightly, ready to step away, but Whitmore spoke again before she could leave. "Miss Carter." She paused. "Yes." Whitmore reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and removed a business card. The simple white card carried only his name and the understated logo of Whitmore Technologies. He placed it gently on the table in front of him. "When your shift ends tonight, I would appreciate a few minutes of your time." Emily looked at the card but did not reach for it immediately. "About what?" Whitmore smiled slightly. "About why someone with your education and instincts is carrying plates in a restaurant instead of working in a place where those skills are expected." Emily considered the card for a moment. Her eyes briefly scanned the name printed across it, though she obviously already knew who he was. Around them, the investors watched quietly, sensing that something unusual was unfolding. Finally, Emily picked up the card and slipped it carefully into the pocket of her apron. "All right," she said calmly. "After my shift." Whitmore nodded once. "I will be waiting." Emily gave a polite nod and moved away toward the other side of the dining room, where another table had been waiting patiently. Within seconds, she was back in motion, refilling water glasses and delivering plates, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But Daniel Whitmore continued watching her from across the room, because he understood something the others were only beginning to realize. The quiet waitress who had overheard a few sentences in Russian had just revealed a mind trained to notice details most people missed. And Daniel Whitmore had built an entire empire by recognizing value in places no one else bothered to look. The dinner crowd slowly thinned as the evening moved toward its quiet closing hours, and Whitmore House Restaurant returned to the polished calm it was known for across Manhattan. Plates were cleared, chairs shifted softly across the marble floor, and the last conversations of the night faded into the gentle music still drifting from the piano in the corner. At a small table near the window, Daniel Whitmore remained seated long after the investors from his meeting had left. His water glass sat untouched in front of him as he watched the dining room with the same patient attention that had built his company from a modest startup into a global technology empire. Across the room, Emily Carter moved through the final part of her shift with the same steady efficiency she had shown all evening. She refilled glasses, carried trays back toward the kitchen, and thanked guests as they gathered their coats and prepared to leave. Anyone walking into the restaurant at that moment would have seen nothing unusual, just another waitress finishing another shift. But Daniel Whitmore understood that the evening had quietly changed something important. Because 30 minutes earlier, he had nearly taken a sip of wine that would have altered the course of his life in ways no boardroom strategy could ever repair. And the only reason that moment never happened was because a quiet waitress had listened carefully when everyone else heard nothing at all. Nearly an hour passed before Emily finally untied the black apron from around her waist and folded it neatly over her arm. The restaurant manager thanked her again for her cooperation earlier in the evening, still visibly amazed by the situation that had unfolded. Emily simply nodded politely and walked toward the front of the dining room. Daniel Whitmore stood when he saw her approaching. "Long shift," he said with a faint smile. Emily returned the smile, though there was a hint of tiredness behind it now. "Most shifts are long in this business." Whitmore gestured toward the empty chair across from him. "Please sit for a moment." Emily hesitated briefly, then sat down across the table. For the first time that evening, she was no longer standing in a waitress's role. She simply sat there as herself. Whitmore studied her for a moment before speaking again. "Tonight you prevented a situation that could have become extremely serious," he said calmly. "You did that because you paid attention to details others ignored." Emily shrugged lightly. It seemed like the responsible thing to do. Whitmore nodded slowly. "Responsibility is rare. Awareness is even rarer." He reached into his jacket pocket again and placed another card on the table, this one slightly different from the one she already carried. "This card will reach my office directly," he said. "If you ever decide that your skills deserve a different environment, call that number." Emily looked at the card quietly for a moment. The offer was simple, but the meaning behind it was not. Finally, she slipped the card into her pocket beside the first one. I will remember that. Whitmore smiled slightly as he reached for his coat. Good. He paused near the table for one last moment before leaving. Because sometimes the most important decisions in life begin with a conversation no one expected to hear. Emily watched as Daniel Whitmore walked toward the entrance and disappeared into the quiet Manhattan night. For a moment the restaurant felt unusually still. Then she turned, picked up her folded apron, and stepped out into the same city where a single quiet moment had already changed two lives in ways neither of them fully understood yet. A quiet evening in Manhattan turns into one of the most unforgettable touching stories when a humble waitress overhears two strangers speaking Russian and realizes that a powerful millionaire sitting nearby may be in danger. What follows becomes one of those touching stories that remind us how intelligence and courage can appear in the most unexpected places. As the attentive waitress listens carefully, notices a suspicious change to a wine bottle, and bravely interrupts a moment that could have changed the millionaire's life forever. This cinematic narrative unfolds as one of the most compelling touching stories where a simple act of awareness transforms an ordinary restaurant shift into a turning point, proving that the sharpest minds are not always seated at the most expensive tables, as investigators confirm that the waitress acted just in time. The millionaire begins to understand that the quiet observer who saved him carries far more insight than anyone in the room realized, turning the encounter into one of those rare touching stories that blend suspense, dignity, and human intuition. By the end of the night, the millionaire recognizes the remarkable character behind the uniform, leaving viewers with one of the most memorable touching stories about respect, hidden intelligence, and the moment when a waitress changes the course of a millionaire's evening with nothing more than courage, observation, and the decision to act when everyone else remained unaware. Character 1. 27-year-old white American waitress woman, fair skin, honey blonde hair tied back, calm intelligent eyes, simple white shirt, and black apron uniform, standing posture, restaurant background, front view portrait, realistic lighting, cinematic realism, no cartoon, no CGI, no illustration. Character 2. 41-year-old white American CO millionaire man, fair skin, confident mature face, short dark brown hair with slight silver at temples, wearing tailored charcoal business suit and white shirt, standing posture, front view portrait, realistic lighting, no cartoon, no CGI, no illustration.